The air in the small wooden church was thick with the scent of pine and stale piety, a suffocating blanket in the afternoon heat. Evelyn stood at the altar, the lace of her mother's wedding gown scratching at her throat. It felt less like a dress and more like a shroud. Her hands, hidden within a pair of ill-fitting gloves, trembled so violently she had to clench them into fists to still them. Beside her, Silas Granger shifted his weight, the fine wool of his suit rustling like dry leaves. He was a man built of sharp angles and cold currency, his face a roadmap of hard bargains and quiet cruelties. At 45, he was more than twice her age, the wealthiest man in Redemption, Arizona, and the owner of everything in it, including, in a few moments, her. The preacher, a thin man with a voice like gravel, began to drone on about union and devotion. Evelyn did not hear the words. She heard only the rhythmic thump of her own heart against her ribs, a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage. She stared past the preacher, through the open church doors, at the sliver of dusty street visible beyond. It was a world of bleached sunlight and endless possibility, a world that was about to be locked away from her forever. Silas's hand found hers, his grip cool and possessive. His fingers were thick, adorned with a heavy gold ring that pressed uncomfortably into her knuckles. He leaned closer, his breath smelling of whiskey and cigars. "Smile, my dear," he murmured. The sound, a low rumble, meant only for her. "The whole town is watching. They should think you are the happiest woman alive." A cold dread washed over her, chilling the sweat on her skin. She had seen his kindness in public, the practiced smiles, the generous donations, but she had also seen the flicker of something else in his eyes when a saloon girl spilled a drink, or when a horse did not obey him quickly enough. She had felt the harshness in his grip when he'd guided her through a doorway, a silent warning of the ownership to come. This marriage was not a union. It was a transaction. Her father, a man broken by drought and debt, had traded his only daughter for a deed to clear fertile land and the cancellation of his accounts at Granger's Saloon and Mercantile. He had called it a blessing. Evelyn had called it a sentence. Her gaze drifted to her parents in the front pew. Her father stared straight ahead, his jaw set, refusing to meet her eyes. Her mother, a ghost of a woman worn down by years of silent compliance, twisted a handkerchief in her lap, her face pale and empty. There would be no rescue from them. They had already turned the key in her lock. It was then that she heard it, faint at first, then growing clearer, the rhythmic clink and jangle of spurs on wooden planks, approaching the church from the outside. It was a lonely, restless sound, the sound of a man who did not belong, a man just passing through. It was the sound of movement, of freedom. The preacher paused, looking to Silas for the vows. "Do you, Silas Granger, take this woman?" The spurs stopped just outside the door. A shadow fell across the threshold. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. It was not a choice, not a thought, but an instinct as primal as drawing air. Her body moved before her mind could protest. She ripped her hand from Silas's grasp. He grunted in surprise, his grip tightening for a moment before she tore free. The preacher's words faltered, his mouth hanging open. A collective gasp rippled through the pews. "Evelyn?" Silas's voice was a whip crack in the sudden silence. But she was already gone. She ran, her borrowed shoes slipping on the worn floorboards. The world was a blur of shocked faces and outstretched hands. She dodged. She burst through the open doors and into the blinding, dusty sun. The heat hit her like a physical blow. A lone horse stood hitched to the rail, a rangy-looking sorrel with a worn saddle and a canteen hanging from the horn. The rider, a tall man in a dusty coat, was just turning away from the church, and he froze, watching her with wide, startled eyes. She did not hesitate. There was no time for propriety, no time for anything but escape. She scrambled toward the nearest horse, a stout gray gelding tethered loosely to a post. Ignoring the mounting block, she bunched the heavy satin of her dress in her fists, and hauled herself onto its bare back. The horse shied, startled by the sudden weight and the rustle of her skirts. She grabbed a fistful of its coarse mane, her knuckles white. "Stop her!" Silas's roar echoed from the church. She dug her bare heels into the horse's flanks. The animal grunted and lunged forward, breaking into a clumsy, powerful canter. The town of Redemption dissolved behind her into a cloud of amber dust and shouting voices. The wind tore the veil from her hair, and she felt it fly away like a surrendered flag. The satin of her dress, a garment meant for quiet rooms and soft chairs, caught on a low-hanging branch and ripped with a sound like a scream. Cool air rushed against her skin. She leaned low over the horse's neck, urging it on. Tears of terror and exhilarating freedom streaming from her eyes and drying instantly in the hot, rushing wind. She rode toward the jagged, sun-scorched hills that bordered the town, a place of shadow and stone, with no destination in mind. Only the desperate need to put as much distance as possible between herself and the man she had left at the altar. The sun beat down without mercy, a relentless hammer against the anvil of the earth. Colt McAllister squinted, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow with the back of a leather glove. He drove the post driver down hard, the solid thud echoing in the vast, empty silence of his ranch. Another fence post settled an inch deeper into the dry, cracked soil. It was honest work, simple work. It kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. And for a man like him, a quiet mind was a rare and precious thing. His land was on the edge of everything, pressed up against the unforgiving hills that separated Redemption from the rest of the world. He preferred it that way. The town and its people were a memory he tried to keep at a distance. They had judged him once, had been ready to watch him swing from a rope for a crime he had not committed. He had been cleared, but the stain of an accusation, he'd learned, never fully washed away. It clung to a man like trail dust, marking him, setting him apart. So he kept to himself, finding a gruff companionship in the wind, the sun, and the solid heft of his tools. He was raising the post driver for another blow when a flicker of white in the distant scrubland caught his eye. He paused, his muscles tense. It was not a deer. It was too large, and it was not moving right. He shielded his eyes with his hand, his gaze narrowing. It looked like a person, stumbling, falling, then rising again. He watched for another minute, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. This was no place for anyone to be wandering on foot, not in this heat. With a sigh that was part irritation and part concern, he set down the driver and walked over to his horse, a steady buckskin named Jasper. He swung himself into the saddle, the worn leather creaking a familiar welcome. He did not want to get involved. Trouble had a way of finding him, even out here, but he could not leave someone to die in the sun, either. His conscience, what was left of it, would not allow it. He nudged Jasper into a slow walk, weaving through the mesquite and brittlebush. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. It was a woman. She was dressed in what looked like the tattered remains of a fine white dress, the fabric torn and stained with dirt. She was barefoot, her hair a wild, tangled mess. She took a few more staggering steps. Then her knees buckled and she collapsed in a heap of white satin and despair. Colt urged Jasper into a faster pace, dismounting a few feet away. He approached her cautiously, his hand resting near the Colt peacemaker at his hip. The West taught a man to be careful. He knelt beside her. She was lying face down, her breathing shallow and ragged. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder to turn her over. She flinched at his touch but was too weak to resist. Her face was smudged with dirt and streaked with tears. Her lips cracked and pale. Her eyes fluttered open, a startling blue in the grime of her face, wide with a hunted, terrified look. Dehydration had set in hard. "Easy now," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He unhooked his canteen from his saddle, uncorked it, and gently lifted her head, bringing the metal lip to her mouth. Just a little. She drank greedily at first, then choked, coughing as the water hit her dry throat. He let her rest a moment before offering more. She drank again, slower this time, the life seeping back into her eyes with each swallow. After a few sips, she seemed to come back to herself, awareness dawning. Her gaze darted from his face to the vast, empty landscape around them, and the terror returned full force. She scrambled backward, trying to push herself away from him. "No," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Please, please, do not take me back. You cannot." Colt remained kneeling, his hands held up in a placating gesture. He recognized the dress now, or what was left of it. News traveled fast, even to his remote corner of the world. He'd heard that Silas Granger was getting married today. The whole town had been buzzing about it for weeks. This had to be the bride, a runaway bride. And not just any bride, the bride of the most powerful, vindictive man in the territory. A cold certainty settled in his stomach. This was not just trouble. This was the kind of trouble that ended with a man swinging from a rope for real. "I am not taking you anywhere," he said, keeping his voice low and calm. "But you cannot stay out here. You will be dead by morning." "I would rather die," she said, the words fierce despite their weakness. "I would rather die than marry him." He saw the truth of it in her eyes. This was not a case of wedding day nerves. This was sheer, unadulterated fear. He looked down at her feet, which were scratched and bleeding from the rocky ground. He saw the desperation etched on her face, and against his better judgment, against every instinct for self-preservation he had honed over the last 5 years, he felt a flicker of something he had not felt in a long time. Pity, protection. "Where would you go?" he asked. "I do not know," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Away. Anywhere but redemption." He stood up, running a hand over his jaw. Silas would have men scouring the countryside for her already. Taking her in was a fool's errand. They would search his ranch. They always started with him when something went wrong in town. He needed to turn her away, point her toward the next town, and wish her luck. It was the smart thing to do, the safe thing. He looked down at her again. She was watching him, her blue eyes pleading, her entire being radiating a fragile desperation. She was just a girl, barely out of her teens. He thought of the smug, satisfied look Silas Granger always wore, the way his eyes lingered on women, as if they were cattle to be appraised. He thought of the whispers about his temper, the stories that were never told too loudly. He had spent 5 years avoiding the town's judgment, living on the fringes to stay out of the way of men like Silas. To help her would be to walk right back into the fire. But to leave her was to be the kind of man the town already thought he was. "You cannot stay here," he said, his voice firm. He saw her face fall, the hope in her eyes extinguishing. "They will look for you here. My place is the first they will check." He paused, the foolish, reckless words forming on his tongue before he could stop them. "But I know a place in town, a place no one goes anymore. You can stay there for the night, just until you get your strength back." Hope, fragile and tentative, bloomed on her face again. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you help me?" Colt looked away, toward the distant, hazy line of the horizon. "Because I know what it is like to have this whole town wanting you gone," he said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "Get up. We need to move before they find us." He helped her to her feet. She was unsteady, leaning on him for support. Her body was frail, but there was a core of steel in her he could feel. He lifted her easily onto Jasper's back, seating her in front of the saddle before swinging up behind her. She stiffened as his arm came around her to take the reins, but she did not pull away. She was too weak to run any farther. As they rode, the slow, rocking gait of the horse seemed to lull her. Her head drooped, her body slumping against his chest. He could feel the slightness of her, the tremor that still ran through her. In this moment of exhausted surrender, her mind drifted back, pulled into the undertow of memory. She was 16 again, Standing in the parlor of their small, failing farm, the air was thick with the smell of dust and defeat. Silas Granger was there, sitting in her father's best chair as if it were a throne. He had been visiting for weeks, bringing gifts, sacks of flour, bolts of cloth, all while his eyes followed Evelyn with a chilling possessiveness. Her father stood by the fireplace, his shoulders slumped, holding a piece of paper, a deed. "Evelyn," her father had said, his voice hollow, "Mr. Granger has made us a very generous offer. He has agreed to take on the farm's debt. He is giving us the deed to the north pasture. We will be secure." Evelyn had looked from her father's ashamed face to Silas's triumphant one. "What does he want in return?" she had asked, though she already knew. "He has asked for your hand in marriage," her mother had answered, her voice barely a whisper. She stood by the window, her back to the room, as if she could not bear to watch the transaction. She was a silent partner in her daughter's sale. Her silence was its own kind of betrayal, a quiet closing of a door. "He is a good man, Evelyn," her father had insisted, the words sounding false even to his own ears. "He is wealthy. You will want for nothing." But Evelyn knew she would want for everything that mattered. She had dreamed of escape for years, of saving enough money to buy a train ticket to somewhere green, somewhere she could breathe. She imagined a small boarding house of her own, with lavender planted by the porch and the freedom to read books in the evening. They were quiet, simple dreams, but they were hers. Now, she watched them turn to smoke in the stifling air of the parlor. She was not being offered a future. She was being sentenced to a life of service in a gilded cage. A shudder ran through her, and Colt felt it. She was waking up. He tightened his hold on the reins, his jaw set. He was a fool, a damned fool. They reached the edge of town as dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and orange. Colt guided Jasper through the back alleys, keeping to the shadows. The sounds of the town grew louder, the tinny music from a piano, the raucous laughter spilling from the saloon doors, the low murmur of gossip. He knew her name was on everyone's lips tonight. He dismounted in the narrow, trash-strewn alley behind the Grand Saloon, Silas Granger's biggest and proudest establishment. He lifted her down from the horse, and her legs nearly gave out from under her. She clung to his arm, her eyes wide as she took in the dark, imposing back of the building. "Here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You are hiding me here?" "It is the last place he will think to look," Colt said quietly, right under his nose. He led her to a thick wooden door at the far end of the alley, half hidden by overgrown weeds. The lock was old and rusted. He pulled a small piece of metal from his pocket and worked it for a moment until the lock clicked open. This used to be the main storage room, before he built the new cellar. No one has used it in years. He pushed the door open. It groaned on its hinges, revealing a wall of impenetrable darkness. The air that wafted out was cool and musty, smelling of stale beer, sawdust, and forgotten things. "I will be back in the morning," he said, his voice low. "Stay away from the door. Do not make a sound. Understand?" She nodded, her eyes fixed on the black square of the doorway. She looked like a frightened child being led into a cellar. He felt another pang of that unwanted protectiveness. He took a small box of matches and a candle stub from his saddlebag. He went inside, struck a match, and lit the candle. The small flame pushed back the darkness, revealing a cramped space filled with old barrels, broken crates, and thick cobwebs that hung from the ceiling like funeral shrouds. Dust motes danced in the flickering light. He set the candle on top of a barrel. "It is not much," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the small space. "It is safe," she replied, her voice filled with a strange kind of reverence. She stepped inside, her torn dress whispering against the dusty floor. She looked so out of place, a fallen angel in a forgotten tomb. He lingered at the door, uncertain. He should leave, He should get on his horse and ride back to the safety of his ranch and forget he ever saw her. But his feet felt rooted to the spot. He watched her as she sank down onto an old crate, her shoulders slumping with the weight of the day. She looked impossibly small and fragile. He remembered standing on the gallows, the coarse rope scratching his neck, the murmuring crowd watching him with hungry eyes. He remembered the sheriff reading the charge, murder, and the way the world had narrowed to the space of a few wooden planks. He had been saved at the last second by the confession of the real killer. But the memory of that rope, of that judgment, had become a part of him. He knew what it felt like to be hunted, to be trapped. Suddenly, footsteps sounded in the alley, heavy and slow. 2 men, their voices low and angry. "Granger's offering $500, one of them said. "For that kind of money. I would turn in my own mother." "She could not have gone far," the other replied. "A woman like that, on her own, she will be crawling back by sunrise." Evelyn's head shot up, her eyes wide with panic. She scrambled to her feet and rushed toward Colt, her hand flying to his arm. The footsteps drew nearer, passing right by the storage room door. Evelyn pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear. The candle flame guttered as a draft slipped through the cracks in the door, casting their shadows long and distorted against the stone wall. She looked at him, her lips forming a silent plea. Then she leaned in close, so close he could feel the warmth of her breath against his cheek, and whispered the words that sealed their fate together. "Don't let them hear." The footsteps faded down the alley. The silence that rushed in to take their place was profound, broken only by the frantic beat of their hearts. In the dark, dusty little room, their breathing mingled, a ragged mix of her fear and his reluctant, dangerous comfort. The world outside was hunting for her, but in here, for this one night, there was only the 2 of them and the shadows that held their secret. The first light of dawn was a thin, gray wash over the dusty alley when Colt returned. He did not knock, but opened the storage room door with a faint click that still made Evelyn jump. She had not slept, had spent the long, dark hours sitting on the crate, the candle stub burning down to a waxy puddle, listening to the night sounds of the town with a terror that was sharp and absolute. Every footstep, every distant shout, had been Silas coming for her. "Time to go," Colt said, his voice a low rumble. He carried a small bundle tied with twine. "We cannot stay here past sunrise." Evelyn got to her feet, her limbs stiff and sore. The world outside the door seemed impossibly bright and dangerous. She followed him without a word, a ghost in a ruined white dress, sticking to the shadows as he led her and his horse through a labyrinth of backways and forgotten paths. He moved with a quiet, practiced confidence that spoke of years spent avoiding notice. They walked for nearly an hour, away from the town and toward the lazy green ribbon of the San Pedro River. The air grew cooler, smelling of damp earth and cottonwood trees. Tucked into a thick grove of mesquite, nearly invisible from more than 20 feet away, was a small shack. It was little more than a box made of sun-bleached planks, with a rusted tin roof and a crooked door. It looked as though a strong wind might carry it away. "It is not much," Colt said, echoing his words from the night before. He pushed the door open, which protested with a long, mournful squeal. "An old line shack. Cowboys used it during roundup season. No one's been out this way in years." The inside was one small room, furnished with a narrow cot, a rickety table, and a small stone fireplace choked with old ashes. A thick layer of dust covered everything. Light streamed in through a grimy, cracked window pane, illuminating the dancing particles in the air. To Evelyn, it looked like a palace. It was a place Silas Granger would never step foot in. It was hers. Colt set the bundle on the table. "There is some jerky, hardtack, and a bit of coffee. A blanket, too. The river water is safe to drink if you boil it first. There is an old pot by the hearth." He turned to her, his expression grim. his gaze direct. "Stay inside. Do not go down to the river during the day. Do not build a fire they can see the smoke from. Lie low for a few days, and I will figure out what to do. Do you understand?" Evelyn nodded, her throat too tight to speak. He was leaving. The thought sent a fresh spike of fear through her. He was her only shield against the world. As if reading her mind, he added, "I will be back. I have to check on my ranch, and I need to go into town. Hear what is being said." He paused at the door, his hand on the latch. "Just stay put and stay quiet." Then he was gone, the door closing with a soft thud, leaving her alone in the dusty silence. Word did not just spread through Redemption. It tore through the town like a flash flood. Silas Granger's bride had vanished from the altar. By noon, the story was on everyone's lips, evolving with each telling. She had been taken by bandits. She had been swept away by a secret lover. She had simply lost her mind. Hand-drawn posters began to appear, nailed to the telegraph pole, the walls of the mercantile, and the doors of the saloon. They featured a crude, unflattering sketch of a woman's face above bold letters. $1,000 reward for information leading to the safe return of Evelyn Hayes, future wife of Silas Granger. The sum was staggering. It was enough money to buy a man a new life, or to ensure he lost his old one for interfering. Silas was not just looking for a bride. He was asserting his power, reminding the entire town that what belonged to him would be returned, one way or another. Inside the shack, the silence that had first felt like a blessing began to feel like a prison. Evelyn was not a woman built for idleness. The fear was a constant, cold knot in her stomach, but doing nothing only made it worse. She looked at Colt's instructions as a challenge. "Stay quiet," he had said, but he had not said to do nothing. She started with the dust, using the hem of her ruined dress. She wiped down the table, the cot, the single shelf on the wall. The work was methodical, calming. She found the old pot, scrubbed it clean with sand from the riverbank, and set water to boil over a small, nearly smokeless fire of dry twigs. She found old newspapers stuffed into cracks in the walls to keep out the wind, and she used them to clean the grime from the window, letting in more of the soft, filtered light. The next day, Colt returned with a few more supplies: a small sack of flour, a tin of lard, and an old, threadbare pair of men's trousers and a shirt. He found her on her knees, carefully patching the torn lace on her dress with a makeshift needle she had fashioned from a sharp piece of wire and thread pulled from the blanket. The room was cleaner, brighter. A small bouquet of wildflowers sat in a tin cup on the table. He stopped in the doorway. Surprised, he had expected to find her huddled in a corner, paralyzed by fear. Instead, she was working, her brow furrowed in concentration. She looked up, her expression guarded. "They are too big," she said, nodding at the clothes he carried. "But they are better than this." He set the supplies on the table without a word. "Did you hear anything?" she asked, her voice quiet. "They are looking for you," he said bluntly. "A big reward. Silas has men riding out in every direction." What about my father?" Colt hesitated. "He is helping with the search." Evelyn flinched as if struck, but her expression hardened. She bent her head back over her sewing, her stitches becoming smaller, tighter. The silence stretched between them, thick with things unsaid. "You should not be here," she finally said, not looking at him. "You should not have helped me. They will hang you if they find out." "They have tried before," he said, his voice flat. Her head snapped up. "What do you mean?" "It does not matter." He turned to leave. "Wait," she called out, a new fire in her eyes. "Tell me what I can do. I cannot just sit here like a rabbit in a trap. I can help. I can cook. I can—" "You can stay quiet," he cut her off, his voice sharper than he intended. "That is how you can help. By not getting us both killed. This is not a game, Evelyn. You do not understand the kind of man you ran from." Her chin lifted. a flush of anger coloring her cheeks. "And you do not understand what it is like to be sold like livestock, to have your entire life decided for you. I have been quiet my whole life. I will not be quiet anymore." She stood up, her small frame trembling with indignation. "You are just afraid. You hide out here on the edge of town, afraid of what they will say, what they will do. You are as much a prisoner as I am." The accusation hit its mark. A muscle feathered in Colt's jaw. His eyes, usually so guarded, flashed with a dark, cold anger. "You know nothing about me," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You have been coddled and protected your whole life. You think because you ran from one man, you are ready to take on the whole world. You are a fool who is going to get herself killed." He turned on his heel and left, slamming the rickety door behind him. The sound echoed in the small shack, a testament to the chasm that had just opened between them. Evelyn stood frozen, her own words ringing in her ears. She had not meant to be cruel, but his insistence on her helplessness had scraped a raw nerve. She sank onto the cot, the fight draining out of her, leaving only the familiar, bitter taste of fear and loneliness. Colt did not return for 2 days. For Evelyn, they were the longest days of her life. She patched the trousers and the shirt, the simple, repetitive motion of the needle a small comfort. She learned the rhythms of the river, the calls of the birds, the way the light shifted through the cottonwood leaves. She learned the sound of her own breathing in the crushing silence. And at night, the nightmares came. She was back in the church, but this time she could not run. Silas's hand was on her arm, his fingers like bands of iron. His face loomed over her, his smile thin and predatory. His voice was in her ear, whispering of the wedding night, of his rights as a husband, of all the ways she would learn to obey. She would wake with a choked gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs, the phantom touch of his hand still on her skin. On the third night, she woke from the dream to find she was not alone. In the dim moonlight filtering through the clean window, she saw a shape sitting on the floor near the hearth. It was Colt. He had come back in the night, silent as a shadow. He was not looking at her, but staring into the cold, dark fireplace, a rifle resting across his lap. He had been there all along, a silent sentinel, guarding her sleep. She did not know how long he had been there, but the realization that he had heard her whimpers of fear, that he had stayed through the night, sent a strange, unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest. She lay back down, her breathing slowly evening out, and for the first time in days, she felt a sliver of peace. The nightmares did not return. In redemption, the gossip was as thick and cloying as the summer heat in the mercantile. Women gathered around the pickle barrel, their voices low and conspiratorial. "Spoiled, that is what she is," one woman declared, adjusting her bonnet. "Her father gave her everything, and she threw it back in his face. A man like Silas Granger, any girl would be lucky." "I heard she was not pure," another whispered, fanning herself. "Ran off because she was already ruined and did not want him to find out." No one spoke of Silas's temper. No one mentioned the saloon girl who had left town suddenly with a bruised face a year ago. No one questioned the transaction that had led to the wedding. In a town owned by one man, public opinion was another one of his assets. Blaming the girl was easier. It was safer. Colt heard it all. He slipped into town near sundown, wearing an old duster and a hat pulled low, his face obscured by 2 days of stubble. He did not speak to anyone, just lingered near the general store, pretending to inspect a harness while he listened. The whispers followed him, the townsfolk giving him a wide berth, their eyes filled with suspicion and old resentments. He was the outcast, the accused murderer. It made him the perfect scapegoat. Inside the saloon, the mood was tense. Silas Granger sat at his usual table in the back, drinking whiskey and staring at the reward poster he had nailed to the wall himself. He looked like a thundercloud waiting to break. The sheriff, A portly man named Blevins, who owed Silas more than just money, approached the table, twisting his hat in his hands. "We have searched the old mining camps. Mr. Granger," Blevins said, his voice placating. "Nothing. My guess is she is long gone, headed for the border." "She is not that smart," Silas growled, slamming his glass down on the table. "She is hiding. Someone is helping her." His cold, dark eyes swept the room, and Colt, watching from the shadows near the door, felt the weight of that gaze. "I want another search party, a real one. I want you to take a dozen men up into those hills tomorrow at first light. Every cave, every canyon, every abandoned shack. Turn over every rock. You find her. You understand me?" "Yes, sir," the sheriff mumbled, backing away. Colt did not need to hear any more. A search party in the hills. They would sweep the area by the river. They would find the line shack. He slipped out the back door of the saloon and into the growing darkness, his long strides eating up the ground as he rushed back to warn her. The wind was picking up, carrying the smell of rain. He found her sitting at the small table, reading one of the old newspapers by the light of a single candle. She had transformed the shack. It was clean, organized. The trousers and shirt lay neatly folded on the cot. She had made a life for herself in this forgotten place. She looked up as he burst through the door, her eyes wide with alarm. "What is it?" "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. He was already gathering the blanket and the few remaining supplies. "Now, there is a search party coming at dawn. They will find this place." "Go where?" she asked, scrambling to her feet, her brief peace shattered. "Back to town," he said grimly. "Back to the storage room. It is the only place they will not look tonight." The first fat drops of rain began to fall as they slipped back into the trees. A cold, steady drizzle that quickly intensified into a downpour. The sky opened up, lightning splitting the darkness and thunder rolling across the valley like cannon fire. They were soaked through in minutes, the cold rain plastering Evelyn's borrowed shirt to her skin. Colt led the horse, his hand a firm, steadying presence on her back as they navigated the slick, muddy path. The alley behind the saloon was a river of mud. They huddled in the shallow doorway of the storage room, the rain drumming a frantic rhythm on the wooden awning above them. Colt worked the lock, his fingers stiff with cold. And finally, the door swung open into the familiar, musty darkness. He led her inside, then closed the door, plunging them into absolute blackness. The sound of the storm was muffled now, a distant, angry roar. They stood in the dark, water dripping from their clothes onto the dusty floor. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could hear his breathing, steady and deep, a stark contrast to the frantic flutter of her own heart. The tension from their argument still hung in the air, but it was overshadowed now by a new and more potent tension, born of the storm, the darkness, and their forced proximity. Colt fumbled for the matches, his hand brushing against hers. A jolt, like the lightning outside, shot up her arm. He found the box and struck a match. The sudden flare of light illuminated his face, his features stark and shadowed, his hair slicked to his head with rain. His eyes found hers, and for a long moment, he just looked at her, his expression unreadable. He lit the candle stub he had left on the barrel, and the small, flickering flame pushed the deepest shadows back into the corners. Evelyn shivered, a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. She wrapped her arms around herself, turning away from him to face the dark wall. "I was so afraid," she whispered, the words coming out on a ragged breath. "On my wedding day, I kept thinking about the night, about him touching me." She shuddered again, a violent, full-body tremor. "He looked at me like I was a thing, something he had bought and paid for. The thought of his hands on me, it made my skin crawl. I hate being touched." Colt was silent behind her, but she could feel his stillness. It was not a vacant silence, but a listening one, an attentive one. He did not move, did not speak, just let her words hang in the air between them. His quiet respect was more comforting than any platitude could have been. She drew a shaky breath, gathering her courage. She had to know. She had to understand the strange, protective feeling his presence gave her. The way the accidental brush of his hand had felt so different from the cold, possessive grip of the man she was supposed to marry. Slowly, she turned to face him. Her hair was damp and tangled, her face pale in the candlelight. Her eyes, wide and luminous, were fixed on his. The air in the small room was thick, heavy with the storm outside and the storm brewing within. She took a small step closer, her voice barely a whisper above the sound of the rain. "Would it feel different if it was you?" He did not answer. He did not move. He simply stared at her, his dark eyes searching hers, 1,000 emotions swirling in their depths. Surprise, confusion, and something else, something deeper and more vulnerable that he kept locked away behind walls of his own. The silence between them pulsed, a living thing, filled with the weight of her question and the terrifying possibility of his answer. The silence Colt left in the wake of her question was a dense and heavy thing. He did not move, did not speak, simply held her gaze across the flickering candle flame. The storm outside raged, a fitting echo of the tempest inside the small stone room. He could have answered with a word, a nod, a shake of his head, but he did none of those things. Instead, he reached out and gently took the candle from the barrel, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second. He blew out the flame, plunging them back into absolute darkness. In that blackness, his voice was a low murmur, closer than she expected. "The storm is passing. We will leave before first light." It was not an answer, but it was not a rejection either. It was a promise of another day. They returned to the shack by the river as the sky was turning from bruised purple to a soft, hopeful rose. The world was washed clean, glistening with rain, the air sharp and cool. The tension of the previous night had changed, the sharp edges of their conflict softened by shared danger. He still kept his distance, but his glances lingered a moment longer, a silent acknowledgement of the question that hung unanswered between them. A few days later, as they shared a meager meal of flatbread cooked on a hot stone, Evelyn found her voice. The quiet safety of the shack, a world away from the judgment of redemption, felt like a confessional. "I always wanted to learn to read properly," she said, her voice soft, as if she were speaking a secret aloud for the first time. "My mother could read the Bible, but that was all. My father said education was wasted on a girl. He said it would only put ideas in my head." Colt looked up from his food, his expression unreadable. He said nothing, but his silence was an invitation to continue. "I used to dream," she went on, a faint, wistful smile touching her lips, "that I would have a little boarding house of my own one day. Nothing grand, just a few clean rooms for travelers, and a garden out front. I would plant lavender. I love the smell of lavender. It smells like peace." She trailed off, a faint blush rising on her cheeks, embarrassed by the foolishness of her dreams in the harsh light of her reality. She expected him to scoff, or to say nothing at all. Instead, he watched her with an intensity that made her breath catch. He was a man who lived in a world of fences, dust, and survival. Dreams of lavender were a foreign language, and yet he seemed to be trying to understand. For the first time, she felt he was seeing her not as a problem to be managed or a fugitive to be hidden, but as a person, with a life she had imagined for herself before it was stolen from her. The realization left him quietly stunned. He had long ago buried his own hopes beneath a layer of cynical pragmatism. To hear her speak of hers was like watching a flower push its way through cracked, barren earth. It was a stubborn, beautiful, and terrifying thing. The next afternoon, he came back from his ranch with something wrapped in an old oilcloth. He placed it on the table between them and unwrapped it. It was a Colt peacemaker, the twin to the one he wore on his hip. It lay on the rough wood of the table, dark and menacing. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his voice flat and practical. Evelyn stared at it, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. It was a tool for killing, an object of brutal, final violence. "I cannot," she whispered. "You have to," he insisted, his gaze unwavering. "I cannot be with you every second. If they find you, if Silas—" He did not need to finish the sentence. "You cannot run forever. Sometimes you have to stand your ground." He took her outside, down to a secluded bend in the river where the sound would be swallowed by the trees and the rushing water. He set up an old tin can on a fallen log. He showed her how to hold the pistol, how to check the chambers, how to aim. The weapon was heavy in her hands, unnaturally so, a dead weight pulling her toward a world she did not want to know. "Keep your arms straight," he instructed, his voice patient. "Line up the sight at the end of the barrel with the target. Squeeze the trigger slowly. Do not jerk it." She raised the gun, her hands shaking so badly the barrel wavered. The tin can seemed to dance at the end of her sight. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes. "I cannot do it," she said, her voice trembling. Colt moved behind her. He did not speak, but placed his hands over hers. His right hand covered hers on the grip, his fingers firm and steady. His left hand gently cupped her other hand, stilling its tremor. He was a wall of solid warmth at her back, his chest brushing against her shoulders. His scent filled her senses. Leather, wood smoke, and the clean smell of the outdoors. The cold, heavy terror of the gun began to recede, replaced by a different kind of tremor, a deep, resonant hum that started where his hands touched hers and spread through her entire body. "Easy," he murmured, his breath stirring the hair at her temple. "Just breathe. I am right here." His presence enveloped her, a shield against her fear. With his hands guiding hers, the gun felt less like a weapon and more like an extension of his will. He helped her aim, his body moving with hers, until the tin can was steady in her sight. "Now," he whispered. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a violent crack that sent birds screeching from the trees. The recoil kicked the gun back hard, but his strength absorbed the shock. The tin can flew off the log, a small, dark hole punched through its center. She stood frozen, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the air, the echo of the shot fading down the river. His hands were still on hers. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact, his hands covering hers, a silent pact of protection and shared strength. Then, slowly, he released her and stepped back, leaving her skin tingling where he had touched her. A few days later, a new complication arrived in the form of a boy. Colt found him collapsed near the fence line of his ranch, a boy of about 12 named Samuel, with a mop of unruly brown hair and a face smudged with dirt. A deep, infected gash on his leg was oozing sickness, and he was burning with fever. Colt knew the boy. He was an orphan who did odd jobs around town, a stray who had learned to survive on the fringes. Colt had given him food and a few coins on more than one occasion. He carried the boy back to the line shack, knowing it was the only place hidden enough. Evelyn's reaction was immediate. She gasped when she saw the boy's condition, her own fears forgotten in a rush of maternal concern. "Bring him here," she commanded, pointing to the cot. "Lay him down." While Colt fetched fresh water, she tore strips from what was left of her wedding dress to use as bandages. She cleaned the wound with a fierce gentleness, her touch deft and sure. She coaxed sips of water between the boy's cracked lips and placed a cool, damp cloth on his forehead. Colt watched from the doorway, a storm of conflict in his eyes. "We cannot keep him here. Evelyn." "We are not sending him away," she shot back, not looking up from her patient. "He is sick. He will die out there." "He is one more person who can give us away," Colt argued, his voice low and tight. One more mouth to feed. One more risk we cannot afford. Some risks are worth taking, she said, her voice fierce with a conviction that shamed him. You took a risk on me. Is this boy's life worth less? Colt had no answer for that. He fell silent, his reluctance warring with the undeniable rightness of her words. He stayed, helping her through the night as they fought the boy's fever, a silent, unacknowledged team. In redemption, Silas Granger was a man coming undone. His fury, once a private thing, was now on public display. He had taken to stalking the floor of his saloon, his face a thunderous mask. He fired a bartender for pouring a short whiskey. He backhanded a man for laughing too loudly. He threatened Sheriff Blevins in the middle of the street, accusing him of incompetence and cowardice, his voice carrying for all to hear. The fear in the town was palpable. Silas's search parties had become more like pauses, riding with a grim, violent purpose. He had doubled the reward, and the influx of bounty hunters and desperate men made the town an even more dangerous place. The law and redemption now had only one name, and it was Granger. Evelyn, consumed with nursing Samuel back to health, began to speak of the future again. But this time, Colt was a part of it. We could leave, she said one evening, as they sat watching the sleeping boy. When he is well enough to travel, we could all go, ride north, no one would know us there. We could start fresh. Colt stared into the fire, his face etched with a familiar sadness. I cannot leave, he said, his voice barely a whisper. This land, this ranch, it is all I have got left. After the trial, after they cleared me, everyone still looked at me like I was a killer. They took my name, my reputation. This piece of dirt is the only thing that is truly mine. It is the only place I can stand and not feel their eyes on my back. His refusal was not an argument. It was a statement of a wound too deep to heal. The news about Lucy came the next day. Colt returned from a quick, dangerous trip to town for medicine, his face grim. I heard something, he said, his voice low so as not to wake Samuel. A young maid from the Granger house. Lucy, they say she was dismissed, thrown out with nothing. Evelyn's face went white. Lucy was the girl who had helped her with her dress, who had looked at her with wide, sympathetic eyes. Because of me, she breathed, a wave of guilt washing over her. She was punished because she helped me. There is nothing you can do, Colt said, his voice firm. But he was wrong. Evelyn's quiet life had taught her to bear her own burdens, but she could not bear the thought of someone else suffering for her choices. That night, after both Colt and Samuel were sound asleep, she slipped out of the shack. She took the small amount of food they had left and the few coins Colt had in a jar. The town was a place of menacing shadows and hostile silence. She moved like a wraith through the back alleys, her heart pounding with every creak and groan of the sleeping town. She found Lucy huddled in the stables behind the mercantile, crying softly in the hay. Evelyn pressed the food and the coins into the girl's hands, whispering apologies. Lucy looked at her with a mixture of terror and gratitude, urging her to run before she was seen. As Evelyn slipped away, the heavy tread of boots sounded at the end of the alley. She ducked behind a rain barrel, her breath held tight in her chest, as one of Silas's men passed by, so close she could have reached out and touched him. She made it back to the shack just before dawn, shaking and sick with fear, but with a small, defiant sense of justice. Colt knew the moment he woke up. The air in the shack was different. He saw the missing food, the empty coin jar. He looked at her, and he saw the truth in the exhaustion and terror still lingering in her eyes. His anger was a cold, quiet fury that was more terrifying than Silas's rages. "Where did you go?" he demanded. She told him, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you a fool?" he exploded, his voice a harsh rasp. He grabbed her by the arms, his grip hard enough to make her wince. "Do you have any idea what they would have done to you if they had caught you? What they would have done to me?" The fear he had been holding back for weeks, fear for her, finally broke through his control. He was not angry at her. He was terrified for her. Tears sprang to Evelyn's eyes, born of her own fear and the shock of his fury. She tried to pull away, and he let her go instantly, his hands dropping to his sides as if he had been burned. He looked at his own hands, then at her, a look of horror on his face. He had never been a man to put his hands on a woman in anger. "Evelyn," he started, his voice breaking. But she was already turning away, a sob catching in her throat. She stumbled out of the shack, running blindly toward the river, the tears she had held back for so long finally falling. He followed her, his anger gone, replaced by a crushing wave of self-loathing. He found her by the water's edge, her shoulders shaking. He stopped a few feet behind her. "I am sorry," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "I was scared. When I woke up and you were gone, I am sorry." She did not turn around, but her sobs quieted. They stood like that for a long time, the silence broken only by the sound of the river, until she finally turned to face him, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. The fight had broken something open between them, stripping away the last of their defenses. That night, a storm of a different kind broke. A rider was spotted near the ranch, and Colt insisted they hide in the storage room until the danger passed. Inside the familiar darkness, surrounded by the ghosts of their first meeting, the air was thick with unspoken emotions. The raw, exposed feelings from their fight lingered between them. "I am afraid," she whispered into the darkness. And he knew she was not talking about Silas. She was talking about him, about the violent intensity of his anger, and the terrifying tenderness that lay beneath it. He reached for her in the dark, his hand finding her cheek. His touch was not possessive or demanding. It was careful, reverent, as if he were touching something fragile and infinitely precious. His thumb stroked her skin, wiping away the memory of his angry grip. He lowered his head, and in the space between one breath and the next, his lips found hers. The kiss was hesitant at first, a question asked in the dark. She answered by leaning into him, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, aching need. It was a kiss that spoke of shared loneliness and a desperate, burgeoning hope. Their desire, held back for so long by fear and circumstance, began to build, a slow, rising tide in the small, dark room. The sounds of the saloon, a distant piano, a man's rough laughter, filtered through the walls, a reminder of the world that wanted to tear them apart. The floorboards above them creaked as someone walked across the room. Evelyn trembled in his arms, pulling back slightly. She pressed her lips close to his ear, her breath a warm puff of air in the cool darkness. "Don't let them hear," she whispered again. The words that had once been a plea of terror, now an intimate invitation, a secret whispered against the skin. He answered by kissing her again, slow and deep, a kiss that was both a promise and a defiance. It was a kiss meant to silence the whole town, to silence the past, to silence everything but the frantic, hopeful beating of their two hearts, finally finding their rhythm in the dark. The kiss in the darkness of the storage room had broken something, or perhaps it had mended something. When they returned to the line shack under the cover of a sky still damp with rain, the space between them was no longer an empty chasm of fear and mistrust. It was filled now with a fragile, terrifying tenderness. The question she had asked, and the answer he had given with his touch instead of his words, had changed the very air they breathed. They moved through the next day in a state of quiet awareness of each other, every accidental brush of their hands as they worked to make the shack more livable. Every shared glance across the small room was charged with the memory of that kiss. The boy, Samuel, was recovering, his fever broken, and he watched them with the sharp, knowing eyes of a child who had seen too much of the world. That evening, as Samuel slept soundly on his pallet by the fire, Evelyn watched Colt stare out the newly cleaned window, his profile a hard, thoughtful line against the fading light. She could feel the conflict rolling off him, the war between his deep-rooted instinct to stay and the new, unfamiliar pull to leave. "You said this land was all you had left," she said softly, walking to stand beside him. He did not look at her, but his gaze softened. "It was," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Before." The single word hung in the air, filled with meaning. Before her. Before he had let someone else's trouble become his own. Before he had discovered that a piece of land was a cold comfort compared to the warmth of a hand in his. He finally turned to face her, his eyes dark and serious. "I will take you away from here," he said, the words coming out as if they had been carved from stone. "Both of you. We will go north, like you said. Find a place where the name Granger means nothing." Hope, so sharp and bright it was almost painful, surged through Evelyn's chest. She had to press a hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. It was a dream she had not dared to truly entertain, and to hear him speak it aloud made it feel real, tangible. "But I cannot just run," he continued, his practical nature taking over. "Not with nothing. I have a small herd of cattle. Good stock. I have a buyer over in Tucson who will give me a fair price. No questions asked. I need 2 days to drive them there, get the cash, and arrange for fresh horses. A safe route." 2 days, she repeated, the words. A prayer. It felt like an eternity. But it was a finite, measurable amount of time. It was a promise. "You stay here," he said, his gaze intense. "Keep the boy with you. Keep the door barred. Do not step foot outside for any reason. In 2 days, I will come back for you, and we will be gone before the sun sets." He left the next morning before dawn. Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched him ride away. A tall, solitary figure melting into the gray morning mist. She wrapped her arms around herself, a tremor of fear and excitement running through her. 2 days. She had to hold on for 2 days. She threw herself into preparation, the physical labor a balm for her anxious mind. She mended Colt's spare shirt for Samuel to wear. She washed their few clothes in the river, her eyes constantly scanning the tree line, and hung them to dry inside the shack where they could not be seen. She packed their meager belongings into a small bundle, the leftover food, the blanket, the tin cup that had held her wildflowers. It was not much to show for a life, but it was everything she needed for a new one. She worked with a frantic, hopeful energy, trying not to let herself think about all the ways it could go wrong. She was so close to freedom, so close to a life she had chosen for herself. The hope was a fragile, fluttering thing in her chest, and she guarded it fiercely, afraid that if she looked at it too directly, it might simply disappear. Colt pushed his cattle hard, the small herd moving through the dry rolling hills like a single dusty organism. He had left Samuel back at his ranch house, thinking the boy would be safer there, with a real bed and more food than he could carry to the line shack. He told the boy to keep the doors locked and stay out of sight, promising to be back in 2 days. But a gnawing unease settled in Colt's gut as he rode. The land felt different, watched. He found himself looking over his shoulder, scanning the ridges for any sign of riders. It was late on the second day when he returned from Tucson, the payment for his herd a satisfying weight in a leather pouch inside his shirt. He had sold everything, cut the last tie that bound him to this place. He had the money. He had the plan. He had 2 strong horses waiting for him at a prearranged spot. He was no longer the lonely rancher of redemption. He was a man with a future. He rode up to his small ranch house, a sense of finality settling over him. He would grab the boy, collect Evelyn, and they would be gone. But the house was silent, too silent. The door was slightly ajar, swinging on a single hinge in the afternoon breeze. "Samuel?" he called out, dismounting, his hand already on the butt of his pistol. There was no answer. A cold dread crept up his spine. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The main room was in disarray. A wooden stool was overturned. A half-eaten piece of bread lay on the floor, covered in dirt. There were scuff marks near the door, the marks of a struggle. of small feet dragging against their will. The boy was gone. Colt's heart turned to a block of ice in his chest. Someone had been here. Someone new. The 2 days he had taken to secure their future had been 2 days too long. He was still standing in the wreckage of his home when the sheriff rode up. 2 deputies flanking him. Sheriff Blevins sat atop his horse, his face a pasty, sweating mask of false authority. "McAllister," Blevins said, his voice attempting a casual tone that did not reach his shifty eyes. "Just making our rounds. Have not seen anything unusual out this way. Have you?" Colt stepped out of the doorway, his body blocking the view of the disordered room behind him. He kept his expression neutral, a mask of stone he had perfected over the years. "Quiet as a grave out here." "Sheriff," he said, his voice level. "That is good to hear," Blevins said, though he did not look convinced. He leaned forward in his saddle, his gaze narrowing. "You know, Silas Granger is a man who does not forget things. He is mighty interested in finding what belongs to him, says he is willing to pay any price, and he is even more interested in finding anyone who might be hindering his search." It was a question wrapped in a threat. Colt could feel the trap closing. He knew Blevins was Silas's dog, sent to sniff around, to find a scent. "I do not trouble myself with town business," Colt said, his voice cold. "Is that a fact?" Blevins pushed. "Because some folks are saying you might know more than you let on. A man with your history, it would be a shame for old troubles to come back to haunt you." Colt's hand ached to draw his weapon, but he held himself still. He met the sheriff's gaze, his own eyes as hard and unyielding as flint. "If you have something to accuse me of, Sheriff, then do it. Otherwise, you are on my land." Blevins held his gaze for a long moment, then seemed to shrink under the weight of Colt's cold fury. He straightened up, tugging on his reins. "Just a friendly warning. McAllister," he said, turning his horse. "Stay out of things that do not concern you." Colt watched them ride away, a cloud of dust in their wake. He was not fooled. It was not a warning. It was a final notice. They knew, or they suspected enough to make no difference. His plan was unraveling thread by thread. Back in the shack, the waiting had become a form of torture for Evelyn. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the leaves, was the sound of Silas's men closing in. To distract herself from the gnawing fear, she pulled the tattered remains of her wedding dress from the bundle of her belongings. She ran her hand over the stained satin, the fabric a reminder of the life she had so narrowly escaped. As she held it, the memory, sharp and vivid as a shard of glass, pierced through her. She was in the parlor again, her father standing before her, his face a mask of grim determination. He was not looking at her, but at the deed in his hand, the paper that represented his own salvation and her damnation. "It is done, Evelyn," he had said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "You will be a Granger." She had looked at him, at the man who was supposed to protect her, and she had seen a stranger. She saw the moment he chose his land over his daughter, the instant he signed her life away as if she were nothing more than a head of cattle. The memory was so powerful, so visceral, that she gasped, stumbling back as if from a physical blow. The dress in her hand suddenly felt like a snake, a venomous thing that had been wrapped around her for years. With a cry that was part grief and part rage, she ripped a long strip from the hem of the gown. The sound of the tearing fabric was deeply satisfying. She took the strip of satin to the fireplace and, with trembling hands, held it to the embers of the morning's fire. The fine material blackened, curled, and then burst into a small, bright flame. She watched it burn until it was nothing but a fragile black ash, a ghost of what it had been. In that moment, she was not just burning a piece of cloth. She was burning her past. She was severing the last tie to the girl who had been sold, the girl who had been silent. She was freeing herself. Colt returned an hour later, the sun low in the sky. She knew the moment she saw his face that something was terribly wrong. The hope that had carried him away 2 days ago was gone, replaced by a deep, shaken weariness. He looked like a man who had seen the gallows. He came inside and barred the door, his movements heavy. "They took the boy," he said, his voice flat and dead. "From my house, and the sheriff paid me a visit. They know. Evelyn, I do not know how, but they know I am involved." The fragile bubble of hope that Evelyn had been protecting burst, leaving a cold, terrifying emptiness in its place. "What do we do?" she whispered. "I do not know," he confessed, sinking onto the edge of the cot and burying his face in his hands. It was the first time she had seen him look defeated, and the sight was more frightening than any threat from Silas. "The whole town is against us. They are bought and paid for. We cannot outrun them. Not now." She went to him, kneeling on the floor in front of him. She did not say anything, but placed her hand on his knee. He looked up, his eyes filled with a despair that mirrored her own. In this moment of shared hopelessness, there was no hiding, no pretense. There was only the two of them, trapped and running out of time. "Stay," she whispered, her voice pleading. "Do not go back to the ranch tonight. Stay here, with me." He looked at her, at the strength and resolve that shone in her eyes even now, and he nodded. The thought of being alone in his empty, violated house was more than he could bear. That night, a slow, steady rain began to fall, a soft, rhythmic drumming on the tin roof of the shack. They sat in silence for a long time, the only light coming from a single candle on the table, its flame casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The world had shrunk to this small, fragile shelter, a tiny island in a sea of danger. Evelyn stood up and walked to the single window, looking out at the rain-streaked darkness. She could feel his eyes on her. Tonight was not about escape. Escape felt impossible. Tonight was about something else. It was about choosing, for the first time in her life, what she wanted, who she wanted. She turned to face him, her heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. She was trembling, but it was not from fear. It was from a profound and terrifying certainty. She began to unbutton the coarse cotton shirt he had given her. Her fingers were clumsy, but her movements were deliberate. She was not a prize to be won or an object to be taken. She was a woman making a choice. Colt watched her, his breath catching in his throat. He started to stand, to speak, to stop her, to tell her that she did not have to. But she met his eyes with a look that silenced him. It was a look of pure, unwavering will. She let the shirt fall from her shoulders to the floor, leaving her in the thin cotton of her chemise. The candlelight softened the lines of her body, turning her skin to pale gold. He saw the faint lines of bruises on her arms from when he had grabbed her, and a fresh wave of shame washed over him. But she did not seem to notice them. She was looking at him, only at him. He rose slowly from the cot and went to her, stopping just inches away. He lifted his hand, not to touch her skin, but to gently cup her cheek, his thumb stroking the line of her jaw. His touch was a question, a promise of tenderness. It was everything Silas's touch was not. He touched her like she mattered, like she was precious. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of gratitude and of a deep, aching release. This was what it felt like to be seen. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss as soft and steady as the rain falling outside. It was a kiss of comfort, of solace, of two lonely souls finding refuge in each other. There were no frantic, tearing clothes, no harsh demands. Their movements were slow, tender, filled with breathless silences as they rediscovered each other in the warm candlelight. He undressed her as if unwrapping a priceless gift, his hands gentle, his eyes full of a wonder that made her feel beautiful. When they finally lay together on the narrow cot, the sound of the rain on the tin roof was the only music in the world. He held her, touched her, and showed her that a man's touch could be a place of safety, a place of reverence, a place of peace. The morning came too soon, a pale gray light filtering through the window. Evelyn woke first, curled against Colt's side, his arm thrown protectively over her. For the first time since she had fled the church, she felt utterly, completely safe. A soft, sleepy smile touched her lips. It was a new day, a day of escape, a day to begin again. Then she heard it, the crunch of a boot on a twig just outside the shack. Her eyes flew open, her body going rigid. Colt woke instantly, sensing her terror. He was already reaching for his pistol when the shack door burst open, splintering off its hinges. 3 men filled the doorway, their faces cruel and triumphant under the wide brims of their hats. Silas's men, behind them. More figures were emerging from the trees, surrounding the small shack. There was no escape. Colt was on his feet in an instant, pushing Evelyn behind him, the pistol leveled and steady in his hand. "Get out!" he snarled. One of the men laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Granger wants his property back," he said, his eyes raking over Evelyn's state of undress with a leering gaze. "And he wants the man who stole it." Colt fired, the explosion deafening in the small space. One of the men grunted and staggered back, clutching his shoulder. But it was too late. The other 2 were on him, a whirlwind of flailing fists and brutal force. He fought back with a silent, desperate fury, but he was outnumbered. A rifle butt caught him hard on the side of the head, and he went down to his knees. They kicked and beat him until he lay still on the floor, a pool of blood forming beneath his head. Evelyn screamed, a raw, animal sound of pure terror and rage. She launched herself at the men, her nails scratching, her fists beating uselessly against their thick coats. One of them grabbed her, his arms wrapping around her like iron bands, pinning her arms to her sides. "No!" she shrieked, struggling against him. "Let him go! Let us go!" They dragged her from the shack, her bare feet stumbling over the muddy ground. She twisted her head, her eyes locking on Colt's still form on the floor. He was alive, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. But he was unconscious, blood matting his dark hair. 2 men were hauling him up, binding his hands behind his back. "You will bring him to the jail," the leader of the men said, gesturing to Colt. "Granger wants him to have a front-row seat when he hangs." Then he turned his cold eyes on Evelyn, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "As for you, the boss is waiting. He says it is time to finish what was promised." They dragged her away, screaming his name, her voice tearing in the cold morning air. As they pulled her back toward redemption, back toward the saloon, back toward Silas Granger. The room was a cage gilded with faded crimson wallpaper and the stench of stale cigar smoke. It was one of the finer rooms above the Grand Saloon, a place where Silas Granger conducted his most private business. Now, it was Evelyn's prison. The door was locked from the outside, the window overlooking a drop too far to survive. On the large 4-poster bed, laid out like a corpse awaiting its shroud, was the wedding dress, her wedding dress. The sight of it, clean and mended by some unseen hand, was a more profound violation than the lock on the door. It was a statement of ownership, a symbol of his unbreakable will. He was not just imprisoning her, he was resetting the stage, preparing to play out the final act she had tried to escape. She had not seen him until late in the afternoon. She heard the key turn in the lock and she scrambled to the farthest corner of the room, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Silas stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. He was immaculately dressed, a stark contrast to her disheveled state. He did not look angry. He looked pleased, like a man admiring a newly purchased acquisition. "There now," he said, his voice a low, satisfied purr. "This is where you belong." His eyes flickered to the dress on the bed. "You will wear that for me tonight. We have a ceremony to complete, a promise to finish." He took a step closer, and she flinched, pressing herself harder against the wall. Your cowboy friend will not be interrupting this time. In fact, Sheriff Blevins has assured me he will be otherwise occupied, permanently, at sunrise. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Sunrise. They were going to hang him. The image of Colt on the gallows, the memory of his gentle hands on hers, his soft kiss in the darkness, rose in her mind, and a wave of nausea and black despair washed over her. "He did nothing wrong," she whispered, her voice a ragged thread. "He stole from me," Silas corrected, his eyes turning cold and hard as obsidian. "And in redemption, no one steals from me and lives. You should remember that." He smiled then, a thin, cruel slash in his face. "Be ready by midnight. I will come for you then." He turned and left, the sound of the key turning in the lock a final, definitive click of the cage door. For hours, Evelyn did not move. She sank to the floor, her body racked with silent, convulsive sobs. She wept for Colt, for his undeserved fate, for his kindness that was to be rewarded with a rope. She wept for herself, for the final, inescapable trap she was in. The hope that had bloomed so fiercely in the little shack by the river had been ripped out by the roots, leaving only a raw, bleeding wound. Midnight and sunrise. The two deadlines pressed in on her, suffocating her. Down the street, in the town jail, Colt lay on a thin, louse-ridden cot, the world a symphony of pain. His head throbbed in time with his heartbeat, and the metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. His left eye was swollen shut, and his ribs ached with every shallow breath. Through his good eye, he could see the sliver of evening sky through the single-barred window, the colors bleeding from orange to purple. He was not thinking about the pain. He was thinking about Evelyn. He could see her face as they dragged her away, her eyes wide with terror, her screams tearing at him as his world went black. He had failed her. He, who had prided himself on his solitude and self-reliance, had let someone in, and in doing so, had led her straight back to the monster. Sheriff Blevins had been in earlier, his face smug. "Granger wants you to have a good view," the sheriff had said with a chuckle, gesturing toward the new gallows being finished in the town square. "Says the entertainment starts at dawn. Horse thief, they are calling you, but we all know what you are really dying for." Colt had said nothing. There was nothing to say. The law in this town was a joke, and he was the punchline. He closed his good eye, shutting out the dying light. All he could do now was wait for the morning and hope that Evelyn, wherever she was, would somehow find a way to survive. Evelyn's tears eventually ran dry, leaving her empty and hollowed out. She sat in the deepening twilight, a ghost in a gilded room, when she saw it, a slip of white paper being pushed under the door. She stared at it, uncomprehending. Then, a faint metallic scraping sound, and something small and dark slid across the floorboards after the paper. With a trembling hand, she crawled across the floor. It was a key, an old, iron skeleton key. The note was folded neatly, the handwriting small and delicate. She opened it. 3 words were written in faint pencil. "Midnight, kitchen door." Lucy. It had to be Lucy. The girl she had helped, repaying the kindness with a risk that could cost her everything. A tiny, impossible flicker of hope ignited in the cold emptiness of her chest. It was a foolish, desperate spark, but it was enough. She looked at the key in her hand, then at the dress on the bed. Silas wanted her ready at midnight. She would be ready, but not for him. The hours leading up to midnight were the longest of her life. She sat in the darkness, the key clutched in her hand, her ears straining, listening to the sounds of the saloon below, the boisterous laughter, the tinny piano music, the crash of a dropped glass. They were the sounds of a world that was oblivious to the life and death struggle happening within its walls. Fear was a cold, constant companion. But beneath it, a new and unfamiliar feeling was taking root. A cold, hard resolve. She was no longer the frightened girl who had run from the church. She had felt a man's gentle touch. She had learned what it was to choose. They had taken Colt, and she was going to get him back. When the grandfather clock in the saloon below began to chime 12, she took a deep, shaky breath. She crept to the door, the key feeling slick with sweat in her palm. She inserted it into the lock, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure they could hear it downstairs. It took several agonizing seconds of fumbling before the tumblers finally clicked. The sound was as loud as a gunshot in the silent hallway. She held her breath, waiting. When no footsteps came, she slowly, carefully, opened the door. The upstairs hallway was empty, lit by a single flickering oil lamp. She crept along the wall, her bare feet making no sound on the runner. She made her way to the back stairs, the ones used by the staff, and descended into the noise and heat of the kitchen. It was empty for the moment, the cook and his helpers likely taking a break. The kitchen door was just ahead, a rectangle of hope. But before she could reach it, she made a detour. She slipped into the narrow, dark alley that ran behind the building. She knew this place. She found the familiar, groaning door and let herself into the old storage room. She did not light a candle. She stood in the absolute darkness, the musty smell of dust and stale beer a strange comfort. This was where it had begun, where he had hidden her, where they had first shared the same small space, their breaths mingling in the dark. She waited, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, listening. She clutched the pistol he had taught her to use, a weapon she had taken from one of Silas's sleeping men on her way out of the saloon. It was cold and heavy in her hand. Suddenly, a tremendous crash echoed from the front of the saloon, followed by a woman's shriek and a roar of angry male voices. Lucy. She had created the distraction. It was time. Evelyn slipped out of the storage room and ran. She flew through the back alleys, her bare feet pounding against the hard-packed earth. The jail was a small, squat stone building at the end of the main street. A single lamp burned in the sheriff's office. She slowed her pace, creeping up to the dirty window and peering inside. Sheriff Blevins was alone, his feet propped up on his desk, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked in. Blevins looked up, his eyes widening in surprise as she entered. He slowly lowered his feet to the floor. "Well, well," he said, a slow, unpleasant smile spreading across his face. "Look what the cat dragged in. Come back to see the show in the morning?" "I have come for him," Evelyn said, her voice shaking but clear. "Let him go." The sheriff laughed, a loud, wheezing sound. "You are in no position to be making demands. Little lady, you are trespassing. In fact, I think I will just lock you up in the other cell. You and your cowboy can spend his last few hours together." He started to stand up, but stopped when she raised the pistol, leveling it at his chest. His eyes widened again, but the smile did not leave his face. He saw her trembling hands, her pale, frightened face. "Now, what do you think you are going to do with that?" he scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "You do not have the nerve." He took a confident step toward her. "Give it to me before you hurt yourself." She saw Colt then, through the bars of the cell behind the sheriff's desk. He was on his feet, clinging to the bars, his one good eye wide with disbelief and horror. "Evelyn, no!" he rasped. "Get out of here! Run!" But she could not run. Not again. She looked from Colt's battered, beloved face to the sheriff's smug, contemptuous one. She thought of Silas's cold pronouncement, of the gallows waiting in the square, of the sunrise that would steal him from her. All the fear, all the rage, all the helplessness she had ever felt in her life coalesced into a single, white-hot point of focus. Her hand steadied. Her voice, when she spoke, was as cold and hard as the barrel of the gun. "I will not ask again." The sheriff laughed again. A fatal miscalculation. "You are bluffing," he said, reaching for the gun. She fired. The explosion was catastrophic in the small office, a deafening roar that left their ears ringing. The bullet screamed past the sheriff's head, so close it snipped the lobe of his ear, and slammed into the stone wall behind him with a spray of rock dust. Sheriff Blevins froze, his hand still outstretched. His face had gone chalk white, the smile wiped clean away, replaced by a mask of pure, abject terror. He slowly raised a hand to his ear, his fingers coming away sticky with blood. He stared at his hand, then at Evelyn, his mouth hanging open. The bluff had been real. The girl was not a girl anymore. "The keys," she said, her voice a dead, flat monotone. She gestured with the pistol toward the ring hanging on a hook by the door. This time, he did not hesitate. His bravado completely shattered. He scrambled to get the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely lift them off the hook. He fumbled at the lock of Colt's cell, his eyes never leaving the pistol she kept aimed squarely at his heart. The lock clicked open. Colt stepped out, his gaze fixed on Evelyn. He saw not the terrified runaway he had found in the desert, but a woman of terrifying strength, a woman who had just stared down death and made it blink. He went to her, taking the pistol from her unresisting hand, his other arm going around her, pulling her tight against him. "The horses," he said in her ear, his voice rough. "Where are the horses?" "Tied behind the saloon," she whispered back, her body finally starting to tremble with the aftershock of what she had done. He pushed her toward the door. "Go! I will be right behind you." He turned back to the sheriff, who was cowering behind his desk. Colt grabbed the man's rifle from the rack on the wall and a box of cartridges. "You try to follow us. Blevins," he said, his voice a low, deadly promise. "And her next shot will not miss." They ran, out of the jail, into the night, the first shouts of alarm beginning to rise behind them. They reached the horses, Colt cutting the reins of the others to slow any pursuit. He swung himself into a saddle, then reached down and pulled Evelyn up behind him, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist. He dug his heels into the horses' flanks, and they surged into the darkness, the second horse trailing behind them. They galloped out of town, the sound of hoofbeats and angry shouts chasing them. As they crested the first hill, Evelyn looked back. The lights of redemption were spread out below them, a constellation of harsh, unforgiving stars. To her, they looked like the embers of a fire she had just walked through, a fire that had burned away the girl she had been, leaving the woman she was now, riding free into the night with the man she had saved. The town lights did not look like home. They looked like a scar. They rode for 2 days and 3 nights, a desperate flight into the unknown. They traded horses at the station Colt had arranged, pushing the fresh mounts to their limits, fueled by adrenaline and the ever-present fear of the pursuit they knew must be behind them. Colt, battered and bruised, rode with a grim determination, his body a testament to the violence they had escaped. Evelyn clung to him, the rhythm of the horse's gallop a brutal, constant reminder of their flight. The world was a blur of sagebrush, canyons, and star-dusted skies. They spoke little, their energy conserved for survival, their communication reduced to the tight grip of her arms around his waist and the steady, protective presence of his body in front of hers. Just as their strength and hope were beginning to fray, they crossed the unmarked border into New Mexico territory. The landscape softened, the harsh, rocky terrain of Arizona giving way to rolling hills dotted with piñon and juniper. They finally arrived at a small, prosperous-looking ranch nestled in a green valley, a plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney like a welcome banner. An older couple came out onto the porch as they approached. The man was weathered and wiry, with kind eyes. The woman was round and soft, her face a welcome map of gentle wrinkles. They were Jebediah and Martha, and they greeted Colt not with surprise, but with a quiet, knowing warmth. "We heard you might be coming," Jebediah said, his voice a low, calm rumble. "A rider passed through from Tucson with a message. Said you were settling your affairs." He looked at Colt's battered face and then at Evelyn's exhausted, pale one, and his expression softened with a deep, uncomplicated compassion. "Trouble finds good men sometimes. Come inside. Martha's got stew on the stove." They owed Colt a debt from years ago, a kindness he had shown them when they were new to the territory and their wagon had broken down. It was a debt they were eager to repay. They asked no questions about Evelyn's torn clothes or the haunted look in her eyes. They simply offered sanctuary. For the first few days, Evelyn did little but sleep, the deep, dreamless sleep of the utterly exhausted. When she finally emerged from the fog of fatigue, she found herself in a world of quiet domesticity she had only ever dreamed of. Martha's kitchen was warm and smelled of baking bread and dried herbs. Sunlight streamed through the clean windows, illuminating a life of peaceful, productive routine. Hesitantly at first, then with a growing sense of purpose, Evelyn began to help. She learned the rhythmic pull and release of milking a cow, the warmth of the animal's flank a comforting presence beside her. She collected eggs from the henhouse, the smooth, warm shells feeling like jewels in her hands. She kneaded dough alongside Martha, her hands, which had trembled holding a pistol, now finding strength and purpose in the simple, life-affirming act of making bread. The bruises on her skin began to fade, but more importantly, the bruises on her soul began to ease. One afternoon, while chasing a runaway chicken, she stumbled and fell into a patch of soft grass. Lying there, looking up at the vast, impossibly blue sky, she began to laugh. It was a strange, rusty sound at first, as if coming from a part of her she had forgotten existed. But then it grew, a genuine, bubbling laugh of pure, simple joy. Colt was standing by the corral, mending a leather strap, and he stopped to watch her. He saw the way the sun lit up her hair, the unbridled freedom in her laughter, and a feeling so powerful and profound washed over him that it nearly took his breath away. He was not just in love with the desperate girl he had rescued, or the fierce woman who had saved him. He was in love with this woman, the one who could find joy in a patch of grass after walking through the fires of hell. He watched her, a quiet awe on his face, and knew that he would spend the rest of his life trying to keep that sound in the world. The news arrived nearly a month after their escape, carried by a traveling preacher who also delivered mail. The letter was addressed to Jebediah, but the news was for them. It was from an old acquaintance in Redemption, a man who disliked Silas Granger but had been too afraid to say so. Silas was dead. His reign of terror had ended not with a dramatic showdown, but with a sordid, drunken brawl in his own saloon. A bounty hunter, angry about not receiving his payment for the fruitless search, had called him out. Words had turned to fists, and fists to knives. Silas had been left to bleed out on the same dusty floorboards where his power had seemed so absolute. In the ensuing chaos and power vacuum, the corrupt dealings of Sheriff Blevins had come to light, brought forth by townspeople who were no longer afraid. He had been run out of town, dismissed in disgrace. Redemption was changing, the letter said, stumbling toward a new, uncertain future. Colt read the letter aloud in the quiet of the kitchen. When he finished, no one spoke. The air was thick with the weight of the words. Dead, dismissed, free. They were simple words, but they felt complex, heavy. Evelyn sank into a chair, her hands trembling. Colt stood by the window, his back to the room, staring out at the peaceful valley that now felt a world away from the place that had shaped and scarred them. This was what they had wanted, what they had risked everything for. True, final freedom. But it did not feel like a victory. There was no elation, no sense of triumph. There was only a profound, unsettling quiet. The monster that had haunted their every waking moment, the force that had driven them together and nearly torn them apart, was simply gone. His death was a random, pathetic footnote to a life of calculated cruelty. It felt too small for the magnitude of the pain he had caused. They were free from him, But they were not free from what they had endured. The scars remained. In the following days, a shadow seemed to fall over Evelyn. The laughter came less easily. The peace she had found in the simple chores felt fragile, undeserved. She would find herself staring off into the distance, her mind replaying the moments of terror. Silas's cold eyes, the sheriff's mocking laugh, the deafening roar of the pistol in her own hand. She was a survivor, but she had become a survivor by committing an act of violence that shook her to her core. One afternoon, unable to bear the confines of the house, she walked out into the open fields, the tall grass whispering around her as she moved. She walked until the ranch house was just a small speck behind her, until she was alone with the sky and the wind. She wrapped her arms around herself, a familiar gesture of self-protection. Did she deserve this peace? Did she deserve to be standing in the warm sun while Silas lay in a cold grave? She had run. She had hidden. She had shot a man. The girl who had dreamed of a boarding house and lavender had never imagined she would have to become this person to survive. The peace felt like a stolen thing, and she was not sure she had the right to possess it. Colt found her there an hour later. He had watched her walk away, had seen the familiar shadow cross her face, and had known she needed to be alone. But not for too long. He came up behind her silently, not wanting to startle her. She did not turn, but he knew she was aware of his presence. "I do not know who I am anymore," she whispered to the wind, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I look at my hands, and I see the woman who held that gun. I do not know how to be the person I was before." Colt came to stand beside her. He did not offer easy answers or tell her to forget. He knew that some things could never be forgotten. His own past was a testament to that. Instead, he simply reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a silent, solid anchor in her sea of doubt. Then, he wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on the top of her head, holding her, letting his strength and his presence be his only answer. He did not need to tell her she deserved this peace. He just needed to show her she was not alone in it. They stood like that for a long time, two scarred people finding solace in the silent, open space until the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of forgiveness. A week later, they made a decision. They could not build a new life with the ghosts of the old ones still clinging to them. They needed to go back, not to stay, but to face the past on their own terms. They said their goodbyes to Jebediah and Martha, promising to return, and rode south. Redemption looked smaller than they remembered, and somehow shabbier without the veneer of fear that Silas Granger had imposed upon it. The gallows in the town square had been dismantled. New faces looked out from the mercantile. The air felt lighter. It was just a town, a struggling collection of wooden buildings in the dust, no longer the seat of a tyrant. They did not speak to anyone. They hitched their horses and walked, side by side, to the Grand Saloon. It was the middle of the day, and the place was quiet. They did not go in the front door. They walked down the familiar, narrow alley, to the old wooden door half hidden by weeds. It was unlocked. Colt pushed it open, and they stepped inside. The storage room was exactly as they remembered it, yet completely different, without the terror, without the desperate need for concealment. It was just a small, forgotten room filled with dust and old barrels. A few shafts of light cut through the grime on a high, small window, illuminating the floating dust motes. It held no power over them anymore. It was just a place. Evelyn walked to the center of the room and turned in a slow circle, her hand trailing over the rough wood of a barrel. She looked at the spot where they had huddled in the dark, where he had kissed her, where her fear had turned into a different kind of trembling. "That's where I found my freedom," she whispered, her voice soft in the still, silent air. Colt came to stand beside her, his gaze following hers. He took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "That's where I found you," he replied. And in that small, dusty room, the last of the ghosts finally seemed to settle. They were not running anymore. They were choosing. They left the storage room, closing the door softly behind them, leaving the past where it belonged. Their new home was miles from redemption. A small plot of land with a sturdy cabin and a view of the mountains. It was the land Colt had bought with the money from his cattle, the foundation for the future he had almost lost. It was not grand, but it was theirs. That night, a soft rain began to fall, a gentle patter on the roof that sounded like a lullaby. The room was lit by a single candle, its warm glow dancing on the simple wooden walls. They lay in their bed, the quiet comfort between them more profound than any words. Evelyn was curled against him, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm holding her close. She was safe. She was home. She lifted her head slightly, her lips finding the shell of his ear. Her breath was warm against his skin, a secret shared in the intimate darkness. "Don't let them hear," she whispered. The old words of fear transformed into a new language, a language of desire and devotion that belonged only to them. "But I still want you." He did not speak. He did not need to. He simply tightened his embrace, holding her closer as the rain fell and the night deepened. A silent, steadfast promise that she would never have to be afraid in the dark again. Thank you for being part of our story tonight. We would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments below to connect with fellow fans. So please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.